Hello, subscribers and non-subscribers to the Nerds Make Media YouTube channel. If you aren't subscribed, please do, especially if you like old archival films, because that's what we post on our channel most of the time, and these are films that I find online and also at the National Archives. I don't live that far away from there, so I go over there and try to find films that are not available elsewhere, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. This is a 75-minute film called Holy Land from Abraham to Allenby. If you don't know who Allenby is, he's a general, British general in World War I. This film was made in 1941, I think. It definitely released before Israel existed, and it's taking a look at the whole history of Palestine, and it actually has Bedouins reenacting parts of the Old Testament, if you can believe that. It's amazing. It's absolutely fascinating film. Because it's so long, I'm going to break it up into 3 parts. This is part 1, the first 2 reels. There's 8 reels in all. And I just want to warn you that this film is British, and it's very condescending in many ways to the culture of the Middle East. But besides, if you can look past that, what they capture, the culture, the tents, the camels, the technology used in agriculture, the practices of the people, it's all very interesting. So if you like it, please subscribe, tell us what you think in the comments, and look for parts 2 and 3 coming in the next few weeks.
Why is it that Palestine has always been a source of trouble to the world? Ever since the days of the Roman Empire, this little country on the east of the Mediterranean has been the scene of wars and revolutions. Yet from the point in the south up to the north, it is only 200 miles long and nowhere more than 50 miles wide. Yet today the Jews are spending millions of pounds building a national home there. And on the other side, the Arabs, with 300 million Muslims at their back, are fighting fanatically for what they consider their natural rights in the country. What is it that causes so much trouble in Palestine? In thinking about Palestine, it is important to get rid of the idea that it has ever been a country as we understand that word. As you can see from the map, in the beginning of history, it was just a corridor between the mountains and the sea, joining the 2 great empires of Egypt and Babylon. And up that corridor, the trade of the 2 countries was carried in camel caravans like this. And in the plains of the corridor, where fought most of the battles that the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians waged between each other from the very earliest time. The other people which has always used this corridor are the nomads from the Arabian desert. Now, a nomad is a person who has no fixed home, but lives in a tent and wanders about, finding pasture for his flocks and herds. And his herds consist mostly of camels. And it was as one of these nomads that nearly 4,000 years ago, Abraham came down from the north into Palestine. The book of Genesis is very accurate in its description of nomadic life. For instance, we read that Abraham passed through the land, although the Canaanite was still living there. And that is exactly what happens today. When the Bedouin, as the nomads are called, cross the Jordan into Palestine, they don't stay there or settle in one place, but they move about, breaking and pitching their camp, just as Abraham used to. The camel is supposed to be the oldest domestic animal in the world, which perhaps accounts for the supercilious expression of this one. The sheiks themselves and of course Abraham was a sheik, live in great tents. And their life is as simple today as it was in Abraham's time. For instance, the sheik will sit through the heat of the day in the door of his tent, ready to welcome strangers or to settle the disputes of his tribe. There is a great sheik's tent, one of the largest tents in Syria. And this man here today rules 10,000 people. These are two of his sons. Then hospitality to a sheik is still as much part of his religion as it was 4,000 years ago. You remember that when Genesis says that 3 men of God visited Abraham, that he ran unto his herds and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to his young men, who killed it, and then dressed it and cooked it in butter and milk. And Abraham stood over his guests while they ate. And that is exactly what happens today when a sheik wishes to honor a stranger. He will kill a sheep or a kid and give it to his young men, who skin it. And then they will cook it in sour milk, which is what you see in those great bowls. In Arabic it is called a leban. And afterwards, in the evening, when the flocks and herds are driven into camp, all the young men who've been out with them since dawn come to the sheik's tent and share the feast, because a meal at which meat is eaten is still in some sort a sacrifice. And then through the night, the sheik will sit telling stories of his ancestors, as Abraham must have told the stories he learned in Babylon. The story of Jacob wooing Rachel is so exact in its details that it might happen anywhere in Palestine today. You remember the book of Genesis says that Jacob went on his journey and came into the country of the people of the east. And he looked, and behold, a well in a field, and 3 flocks lying by it. And Jacob said to the shepherds, Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And behold, even now his daughter Rachel cometh with his sheep. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, he went near. And he rolled away the stone that was at the well's mouth, and watered the flocks of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel, and told her that he was Rebekah's son. And Rachel ran and told her father. And when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him. And Laban kissed Jacob, and embraced him, and took him to his own home. And then you remember the rest of the story, how Leah was first given to Jacob for a wife as the elder sister, according to Bedouin custom, and Jacob would have done service by looking after the flocks and herds of Laban. And then he would have had a great tent of his own, and become a sheik in his turn with a large family. All these boys here are the sons of one sheik. His wives live behind that great rug in what is known as the harem. And on the right in a minute you'll see the slaves. Bedouins still have slaves, although now they are really hereditary servants who have lived with the family for many years. They are, in law, free. This one here is the coffee slave pounding coffee. Jacob's family would have been at least as large as this. And then when Rachel joined his tent, she would have done the work of his house, grinding corn and sewing his clothes. And we read that Jacob increased exceedingly, and had much maidservants and menservants and cattle and asses, until it must have been that there was no room for him and Laban in the same country. And then Jacob set his wives and his sons upon camels, and came down into the land of Canaan. In Canaan he lived first at Shechem, and then at Hebron, and from Hebron he was driven down into Egypt by famine. We have not attempted to tell the story of Joseph, but Egypt outside the towns must be the same today as it was in his day. The pyramids to Jacob and his tribes would have been antiquities of about 1,000 years old, and the Nile, then as now, flooded the country twice every year, so that though there might be famine in the rest of the Near East, there was always corn in Egypt, as Jacob had heard. The boats on the Nile, on which the corn is brought down from the Sudan and Upper Egypt, are called feluccas, and are much the same as the boats used at that time. And you remember that Joseph collected corn as the sand of the sea, until he ceased numbering. And you can tell from the primitive instrument that this old man is using, that their methods today are very much the same. And this granary just outside Cairo must look very much like the granaries which Joseph used. The Israelites themselves settled in the plain of Goshen, which is a fertile district on the east of the Nile Delta. And it is thought that when they first arrived, the pharaohs of Egypt were of the same Semitic race, called shepherd kings, and that the Israelites were allowed to lead the easy nomad life of the half-settled nomad. But then, as that verse in the Bible implies, a new pharaoh drove out the shepherd kings and brought the Israelites under the law of the land, which has always included forced agricultural labor. And you can picture them using this very implement to irrigate the fields. It's called a shadoo. And its buckets tip the water up into the ditches, and then these wheels raise the water again to a higher level. It doesn't look very arduous work, but then you've got to remember that to a nomad, manual labor of any kind is not only a hardship, but an indignity. And at first, no doubt, this was really all the Israelites were complaining against. The bricks they made are still made and used in the same way. Mud is mixed with water, and then both are mixed with chopped straw. And the point of the straw is not only that it binds the brick, but that it prevents the mud from sticking to the builder's hand, and the mold from sticking to the ground. So you can see that when the Egyptians refused to supply straw any longer, and yet the Israelites had to supply the same number of bricks, that their work would have taken them more than twice as long. And this was an irritating hardship. And when that type of petty persecution turned to real oppression, then, in the end, the Israelites rebelled and fled. There you can see the straw very plainly. Tradition has it that the Israelites and crossed the top of the Red Sea down into the peninsula of Sinai, and that Mount Sinai is at the bottom. From there they would have turned north to Rephidim, and then up to Ezion-Geber, and so up to Kadesh. And at Kadesh they must have stayed for several years. And in thinking about the Exodus, try first to picture the tremendous change of scenery they would have met even on their first day. The Nile is a country of trees and shade and water, but now they were in a scrubby desert where any tree is almost startling in its loneliness. Then the desert in this part of the world plays queer tricks, and the wind whips up the sand into great spirals which travel over the ground at a tremendous speed, and to the Israelites must have seemed as if moved by invisible spirits. The land itself is twisted, and the wind howls in these great cavities and moans in the rocks. And as their camels' feet trod noiselessly over the sand, even at the end of their first day, the Israelites must have begun to feel something of the awe of their great adventure. Nobody knows quite where they camped, but the scene of their camping still happens every day in the desert. The leaders select a site a long way ahead and then make their camels kneel down. And the tribe, following in groups, every family with its camels, chooses their own site round the leaders, and the head wife makes her camel kneel, and then the bags are unloaded just where the tent is going to be raised up, and the tent is spread out over the baggage. Then the women hammer in the pegs. The women seem to do all the work, while the men sat and watched. And so the tent is raised up. Usually a woman works single-handed, and it took one woman about 20 minutes to raise a tent. In the evening, or just before sunset, the men would come in for their meal. And when there were no guests, and by now we were not considered guests, their fare would simply be a few dates and rice mixed with this sour milk called a leaven. It doesn't sound very appetizing, but they certainly thrive on it. And they eat it, as you see, out of a bowl on the ground with their fingers. And then next day the whole process would start again. You can tell from the length of the shadows that the camp has to be moving before dawn. And while the children sleep among the baggage, the women roll up the tents and put them on camels. And here the men did help. It was about the only time we saw them doing any work. The camels protest very loudly, and the bad-tempered ones often throw off their loads. This one got muddled up in his tent poles. When every camel's loaded, they're let loose and stand waiting for the head wife to lead the way off. And the children and the old women are put in litters made of cane. These antler-like litters belong to the sheik's wives and are often covered with awnings. They look very picturesque, but one of our party traveled in one for some way and soon felt very seasick. Of course, in a picture, this looks rather picturesque and romantic, but the thing to remember is that this is one of the hardest and poorest lives in the world. This tribe here had been traveling for 4 nights of the week, with its wells running dry and its flocks and herds starving, and they are hardened to it. Imagine what it must have been for the Israelites, fresh from the Nile. Even these men, who had never lived anywhere else, had already fallen asleep twice while we were photographing. And think of the Israelites, with the pictures of the Nile in their mind, with its boats piled high with corn, and with all its water and shade and good things to eat. Is it any wonder that the congregation of the Israelites murmured against Moses and Aaron, and asked to be taken back to Egypt, and asked why they had been brought out into the desert to die, and left the flesh pots behind them? And then, at Marah, they came to a well. And the wells in the desert are very deep and are worked either by camels or by human beings. Beginning at sunrise, they walk backwards and forwards, pulling up the skin bucket on a long rope. And you can tell from the length of this rope that this actual well was more than 100 yards deep. It takes them all day to water their flocks and herds, so that wells are hardly a rest. Only at an oasis, as is said in Genesis, do they rest. And at an oasis, a nomad really seems to come to life and enjoy himself. And you can picture the Israelites at Rephidim and elsewhere, lazing about with their beasts, and just eating and drinking, and no doubt being as difficult to manage as they were on the march, although in another way. And one of the oases was Sinai. Now you're in an aeroplane looking at the great granite mountains in that part of the world, one of which is undoubtedly Sinai. They stand sheer out of a dead flat desert for 2,000 and 3,000 feet. On top, these mountains are nothing but barren rock, dropping sheer for 2,000 and 3,000 feet. You cannot imagine any more desolate or awe-inspiring place than the tops of the Mount Sinai where Moses went up unto God. This is a model of the tabernacle made by a Dr. Sheik in Jerusalem, according to the instructions in the Bible written about 1,000 years later. That is the Holy of Holies, and that is the great altar of sacrifice in the courtyard. The real tabernacle, as the name implies, must have been one of these great goat's hair tents, and the scene outside it when the Israelites prayed, not unlike this scene, although these men, of course, are Muslim. At Sinai, too, Moses organized the tribes under captains of hundreds and captains of 50, and gave them their laws. And that system is still working today. The sheik here is sitting to judge the people, just as Moses said. And opposite him is the accused man, and on one side his witnesses, and on the other his accuser. And the sheik is expounding the Mosaic law, and it is used even to try murder today.